Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1992 historical drama film, Hoffa. Now, Hoffa is one of those films that's based on a true story because it takes so many creative liberties with what actually happened that it becomes more of a work of historical fiction than anything else. But it's not a bad film. Uh, I think it's better than some people make it out to be, but I also agree with the critics when it comes to certain elements of it that just didn't really live up to its full potential. When you have a cast as good as this film has at its disposal, and you have all of these other elements that are going for it, an interesting and compelling enough plot line, and all these other aspects of the production that are really genuinely good. When you have a film that just turns out to be above average and good and pretty decent, but not great, that is honestly a bit of a letdown. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on Hoffa, I want to give a special shout out to Phil for requesting this review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. Link to both is in the video description down below, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, Hoffa is a film that's directed by Danny DeVito. And prior to this, he did mostly comedies. I think that's all he did, really. Throw Mama from the Train, War of the Roses, and he did some good work with those comedies. But nothing that he did prior to Hoffa really suggested that he was the guy to direct the biopic about Jimmy Hoffa. It just didn't seem like this was necessarily the best fit. And he gives it his best shot. He tries as hard as he can, but his best is just above the mid tier. And so what you get is above average direction for a film that costs millions of dollars and has such a dynamic and strong cast and has a script by David Mamet. And so what you have with Hoffa is a movie that I feel is really held back from being its best possible uh, uh, version of itself because of its director and his own inherent limitations. I mean, Danny never did another film like this. He never did another big budget historical epic. He never directed a straight up drama. He did more dark comedies. And so, because of everything that happened with Hoffa, I think even he realized that this wasn't really the best fit for him and for his career as a director. And you can kind of tell, like, there are moments where some scenes should really be more dynamic and they really aren't. And then you have other scenes that are overly showy to the point where it comes across like it's a comic book film because Danny DeVito is trying to show everybody that he's a master filmmaker with different sort of ways that he's framing the shot or he's experimenting with the direction, and it leads to moments in the movie that are honestly more distracting than anything else because there's no consistency to it. Okay, he'll do some camera trick in one scene and then it'll just go back to being a regular sort of film in terms of its visual style. So the moments where he experiments with it, they stand out, but not necessarily in the best way because it's not really something that's consistent with the majority of the film when it comes to the direction. And the same thing happens with, different sort of camera angles and different other varying film techniques. It's just one of those movies where DeVito, it seems like he's kind of learning on the fly and improvising with his direction. And it leads to some scenes looking very staged. It leads to some scenes looking like they're just there just so he can show off and not necessarily for them to be placed in the film in a natural progression. And I know the producers of this film, they had other directors in mind. In fact, they tried to get Oliver Stone and John McTiernan on board, but that didn't work. And then Barry Levinson became the front runner, but he declined because David Mamet refused to make any script changes. And so the producer, Pressman, because he was pressed into finding a director for this movie, he settled upon Danny DeVito. And I think he was swayed in DeVito's direction because DeVito was willing to pony up some of his cash to throw into the pot for the film's production budget. So that just sweetened the deal for him. So it was like, okay, Danny, you got it. But I don't think Danny really was the guy for the job. I don't think he was the one that got the directing job for this film because he really was the best available director. He got the directing job for this film because he was willing to grease the wheels, so to speak, so he can get the job. And I'm not going to sit here and say that he did a atrocious, abysmal, bad job. It's not worthy of a Razzie nomination, but it's not consistent enough to be considered to be great. It's got its moments of brilliance. It's got its moments that show that DeVito knows his way around a camera and seems to have some semblance or idea of a signature style. But those moments aren't really something that really sticks. It doesn't remain consistent or a constant throughout the film when it comes to the direction. Now, the film is written by David Mamet, and this screenplay to me is honestly one of the other main issues that this film has that really prevent it from living up to its full potential. It's okay if you take some creative liberties with the story, but the way that it does it just felt like it was unnecessary. Like the whole stuff with the Roadhouse diner, instead of it being the actual diner that Hoffa was last seen at before he died. Why did you have to change things so much and change the location of the diner and then essentially make up a bunch of fiction and fantasy about how Hoffa died when there was plenty of material available and plenty of theories that were more plausible that you could have went with. But instead, it's this very fictionalized, stylized approach of how Hoffa died, and it comes across as, I wouldn't say a joke, but it definitely does come across not necessarily in the best light. And another thing that hurts this story and the script is the way that's presented. It's too much from the perspective of Hoffa's right-hand man and Bobby, played by Danny DeVito. So it becomes more of a Bobby film than it is a Hoffa movie. And I'm wondering if that is something that really came to the forefront when DeVito signed on as the director. Because there's a lot of earmarks in this movie that make it come across like a vanity project for Danny DeVito. Oh, I get to be the co-star. I get to be acting alongside Jack Nicholson. I get to direct myself and Jack Nicholson in the same scene. And so I don't necessarily mind different sort of ways to tell a biopic's a story, especially when it comes to a different perspective. But I don't know if this was the right choice for the Hoffa film, because it makes it seem like Hoffa is kind of a secondary character in his own movie at points, which I don't really think was the best approach. And I think there's a place for Bobby, but Bobby didn't need to be as prevalent and as common when it comes to his appearances throughout the story. It didn't really have to be. It really should have been more about Hoffa from the very beginning, and him rising to power, and him working with the Teamsters, and going up the ladder, and he meets Bobby along the way and these other people that become a part of his inner circle, so to speak. He does the whole thing where he's meeting with organized crime members to help him get some muscle and give him an upper hand to try to, you know, break these companies and get them to submit to the demands of the Teamsters and to the workers. And instead, it's this very fractured, weird way that the story is told, which is from around the point of Hoffa's death. It's from the perspective of his right hand man, Bobby, reminiscing about the past when they first met and things that happened after that. And so, because of the fact that a lot of it is presented in a way where it's like flashbacks from Bobby's perspective, when you have scenes that aren't featured with Bobby up front and center, or Bobby even in the scene, it comes across like it's out of place. Okay, this is supposed to be Bobby reminiscing and recollecting the past, and then you have scenes with Hoffa arguing with Robert Kennedy, and Bobby isn't really there in the room. So why is that going on? And so there's a lot of moments like that where it just seems like Hoffa, he appears intermittently throughout his own movie. And it does kind of take you out of it a little bit. Also, I don't feel the script did the best job in terms of fleshing out Jimmy, his wife, and all the other figures in his life, all the other important figures in his life. Like, they were not really fleshed out to the point where I felt like they were real three-dimensional characters. And so I think that definitely does hurt the film and hurts the story. But it still has some very effective moments. There are still some great scenes of intensity and impact, mainly all from Hoffa. His feud with Robert Kennedy, his just dogged determination to um, do what in his mind is the right thing, and also put food on the table for himself. And all he was willing to do in order to maintain his power. I got to do what I got to do. And I think that the corruption of Hoffa definitely could have been explored more than it was. I think the way that Hoffa is portrayed is in almost a heroic and sympathetic light, which I don't really feel was necessarily earned. And that's why DeVito, prior to the movie even coming out, he was under fire when he said in an interview he views Jimmy Hoffa as a hero. And you see that in this movie, that whole perspective of Jimmy Hoffa. And I think there is something to be said about Hoffa genuinely doing some good things, doing some great things for the Teamsters Union and for other people, the working man. But that doesn't mean that he should be painted in a mostly heroic and sympathetic light. The whole scene where the Teamsters are uniting and the truckers are parked on the side of the road to say thank you to Hoffa when he's being taken to prison. Like stuff like that that just comes across like it's just hackened and trumped up and honestly kind of bullshit and just almost saccharine, sugary sweet to the point where you're kind of like, yeah, come on, give me a fucking break. Maybe that did happen, but the way that it was presented, it just came across like it was just something straight out of a fantasy. And so that's another issue. Like there's tonal issues of this script where it's kind of all over the place with its tone. It's serious, but then it's not. And it's trying to be thought provoking in terms of what Hoffa is willing to do and the lengths he's willing to go to in order to ensure the Teamsters Union gets what they deserve. Uh, and then it's also trying to be this almost comic book recollection of this visage and facade of Hoffa, that he's this amazing man who was just misunderstood and yeah, he did a deal with the devil, but he did it for the greater good. Stuff like that. It's just it makes you very conflicted as a viewer because you're like, wait a second, like this just it just doesn't sit right. Because when you do your own research, Hoffa was not really like that. Like there were some elements of Hoffa that represented that, but there's a lot that didn't. That isn't even mentioned or isn't even really discussed that much in this movie. And then you throw in the ending, which is just completely made up, and it just makes things all the more disappointing. You want you just the movie, honestly, when it's over, it makes you feel like you're wanting, like you want more. You want more of this story. You want more of Jack Nicholson's enigmatic and excellent performance. And you want to see more of Hoffa and everything that happened, after he got out of prison, and you don't really get that. And there's just a lot of stuff that just seems like it's missing, or it's not really mentioned or really delved into that much. And it just feels like it's incomplete. Like there's a whole bunch of other things involving the story of Jimmy Hoffa that is missing. It's like pages missing out of a biography. That's really uh, what it's like watching Hoffa. But it does have its powerful moments. When Hoffa first wins the presidency, of the Teamsters Union, and becomes the president, the head of the Teamsters Union. The whole scene where he's standing in front of a crowd, and it's this massive crowd, everybody cheering him on and holding signs and carrying him on their shoulders. Uh, the sequences even earlier on when he is involved in that explosion that fatally burns one of his own men who dies tragically due to the burns, and the stuff where he's getting involved in these fights and these scuffles with these other companies that are trying to beat the Teamsters down, and there's a lot of aspects of this, including some of the stuff with his friend Bobby and their relationship and their friendship and their connection with one another. And how they go down together and they wind up going to prison, and how that affects the both of them. And there's just a lot of stuff that I do like about this script. But I'm not a big fan of the framing device. I'm not a big fan of the tonal shifts. I'm not a big fan of how obviously historically inaccurate it is, in a way that does honestly come across more like a comic book than an actual history book. And it just feels like it's ultimately missing so much. It's missing a genuine like heart and soul to really make a lot of the more emotional sequences resonate in a more strong fashion. It's lacking, in all honesty, mostly consistency. Like, it's just an inconsistent script and an inconsistent film. But the moments where it gets things right, it's actually quite remarkable. And the same thing goes for the script. So it is one of those movies where you've got a great film in there, but it just doesn't quite fully come into focus. And I do blame the script in a significant way for why that winds up being the case. Because I'm not going to blame the cast. I mean, Jack Nicholson was fantastic. It was honestly one of his best acting roles as Jimmy Hoffa. He was really good in it. And you could really tell the passion that he had for playing this role. Like, he really wanted to do this. And you can definitely see that in every scene. Like, the moments when he is just blowing up at Robert Kennedy, and just tearing him apart verbally, and the moments of bravado, the moments when his facade is brought down and he's desperate and he's talking about, how he's got to do what he's got to do. And there are just a lot of different sequences and different uh, uh, lines of dialogue and different exchanges with Nicholson in this that are genuinely great. So a big part of why Hoffa still works and is still at the very least a good film is because of things like Nicholson's performance as Jimmy Hoffa. You can't take your eyes off of him. He's so mesmerizing in this. And it's just a really strong performance. And the fact that he seems like he's kind of in the background in his own movie, and you don't get as much of him as you want to, that is definitely one of the more disappointing things about Hoffa. Because Danny DeVito, he just takes up too much screen time as Bobby. And it's no offense to Danny. It's nice to see him try to do a dramatic role. And I thought that he did a pretty decent job doing it, but he didn't need to be in it as much as he was. He really did not. And his performance is honestly at its best when he was like balancing the seriousness and the dramatic acting with like his signature comedy. But you don't get a lot of that. Like, there's a couple bits like that throughout the movie, but a lot of it is just him trying to play it straight. And I think there's moments where it works, but then there's other moments where it's just not really that great. It's just kind of there. Armand Assante, though, as D'Alessandro, uh, he didn't really have the most complex character, but it was still a very steely, very cold, very calculating performance that I definitely feel ranks among some of his best work. J.T. Walsh as Frank Fitzsimmons. the man who ultimately double crosses Hoffa. He did a good job playing a two-faced snake, which he is so good at playing those kind of roles. The guy who looks unassuming, doesn't look like he would hurt a fly, but there's something under the surface, and you just feel like there's something about this guy that you can't trust. And then, when he turns when he turns on Hoffa, you're like, yeah, I can definitely see that. This guy's a weasel. Like he's really good at playing those weaselly kind of roles. And John C. Reilly, he plays Petey Connolly. This other guy was a member of Hoffa's inner circle, so to speak, and he's the one that's very weak and very shy and unassuming and easily manipulated. And John did a great job playing that particular role. This was around the time when he was typecast as that kind of character because he played a similar role in Casualties of War, but it still works. I think I still think it's a good performance. And Kevin Anderson as Robert F. Kennedy, he was only in it for like a few scenes, and he knocked them out of the park. Like he legitimately made me believe I was watching Robert Kennedy. Like did a good job with the accent. He even looked the part. That was a really good performance by him as Robert Kennedy. And John P. Ryan as Red Bennett, this guy who was a very influential figure in the Teamsters Union. Um, he was great. I remember him the most for playing bad guys in canon films. He was the main villain in Avenging Force. He was also the main bad guy in or he's one of the bad guys in Death Wish 4, the Crackdown. So it was fun to see him in like a big budget, serious, almost Oscar bait kind of movie. It was fun to see him in that. I was like, oh, it's the bad guy from Avenging Force. Okay. And he did a good job. And Frank Whaley playing the young trucker who turns out to ultimately be Hoffa's hitman. It was not a bad performance, but that entire character was just really lame. So it's not Frank's fault, but that character was lame as hell because you could just tell that character was gonna shoot Hoffa. Like it wasn't shocking at all. It seemed like the writing was on the wall from the very beginning. This guy showed up at the diner, or he was there at the diner while Bobby was there waiting for D'Alessandro. Natalia Nogalich as Josephine Hoffa. I think she did a really good job when it comes to the few scenes that she was in, but she was never really given much of a chance to shine. I wanted to see more of the relationship between Josephine and Jimmy, but you never really got that. Instead, we're focusing a lot on Bobby. And to me, that wasn't as interesting as what's going on with him and his wife. Because his wife is there with Hoffa every step of the way, behind closed doors and behind certain doors that Bobby isn't privy to. And she still remained by his side through everything. And so I wanted to know more about her and her convictions and her potential questions about Hoffa's connection to organized crime. But you never really got to that point. So there really wasn't much for Natalia to work with. Now, Nicholas Pryor is his attorney. He also did some good work. So did Robert Prosky as Billy Flynn and like the two scenes that he was in. And you have like Paul Gulafol, who plays Ted Harmon, this reporter who's trying to run a story about Hoffa until he gets intimidated to drop it. And then you have like some uncredited cameos. You got Bruno Kirby, who plays a nightclub comedian. And then you have Jon Favreau as an extra. Then you have Tim Burton, who plays a corpse in the movie. Just a random Tim Burton cameo as a random corpse. But yeah, it's a really good cast. So that's another reason why this film is ultimately kind of disappointing because of the fact that you have such a good cast and then you just have a kind of above average movie. The cinematography by Stephen H. Burnham or Burham, it was fine for the kind of film that this is. I felt that there definitely were some moments where his style and his vision for the film meshed with what Danny was trying to do. And so that led to definitely some of the more striking sequences in the film when it comes to the visuals. And the editing by Ronald Roos and Lindsay Klingman, I also felt that that was pretty good too. And it was also at its best when things just aligned when it comes to what Danny was trying to do with the movie, but it was nowhere near as good when it comes to moments where Danny's inspiration wasn't fully captured with the finished film. So there are some moments where the editing is a bit eh, and I think a lot of that has to do with just the overall inconsistencies with the film from top to bottom. The scores by David Newman, and this score is considered to be like one of the best scores ever. And I didn't really feel that it was. Like, I felt like, okay, there are some nice notes to this score, and there are some moments that where it does have some inspiring compositions and usage of different types of instrumentation, but it sounds kind of generic. There's almost points in this score that sound like the Mighty Ducks to me. And David Newman did the score for the Mighty Ducks. So I'm like, okay, this is pretty inspiring, pretty nice, pretty good, pretty cool, but it kind of it just it didn't really sound like anything that was like that special. At least not to me. But it wasn't a bad score by any means at all. It just one of those scores where you're kind of like, okay. And what's crazy is he did the Mighty Ducks the same year. So I'm wondering if he like recycled some bits or some refrains from Hoffa for the Mighty Ducks, and that's why it sounds so familiar. But I didn't watch Hoffa until years later. So when I was hearing some of the stuff in the score, I was like, oh, that kind of sounds like something I'd hear in the Mighty Ducks. But it's still not a bad score. I just thought it was good. I didn't think it was great either. So there's another element of the film that I didn't feel was great. And it's like over 2 hours, and it doesn't have the best pacing at points because of the fractured way that it tells its story, because of the lack of depth, because of these other things that hold it back. But it's still, for the most part, engaging enough because of the performances and because of the aspects of the story that are well done and are well written overall. So Hoffa, to me, it's an honorable job. It's an honorable job by pretty much everybody involved, but it's not a tremendous job. So that's just my thoughts on Hoffa. And until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.